Good afternoon. Welcome to The Analyst. Today we'll be taking up 7 newspaper articles from the Hindu and the Indian Express and discussing them. The handout for the same will be available in the description of this video for your kind perusal. Please have a look at that. The first article that we'll take up is related to the debate on delimitation. As the Bihar governor Arif Mohammad Khan has claimed that the north-south divide at the core of the debate is a false narrative. The second article is related to the drug quality and the issue of spurious drugs in India, as the deaths of at least 10 children in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan has been linked to the adulteration of diethylene glycol in a cough syrup. Additionally, we'll take up 5 articles in the simplified section which will be helpful for your prelims and mains preparation. The first article is related to the delimitation debate, as the Bihar governor Arif Mohammad Khan has claimed that the north-south divide, which is usually at the core of this debate, is a false narrative. He has claimed that if we look at the data from 1881 to 1971, the population growth rate in the southern states during that phase was way more than the population growth rate in the northern states. From 1881 to 1971, the population growth in the southern states was to the tune of 190%. Whereas during the same period, the population growth in the northern states was just about 115%. Whereas if you look at the story after 1971, it reversed. After 1971, the population growth in the northern states has been way more than the population growth in the southern states. Therefore, the southern states do not want the delimitation process to be carried out as per the 2026 census, as they are afraid that they may end up on losing the political representation, because the population growth after 1971 in the southern states has been way slower than the population growth in the northern states. The article claims that the delimitation process should be carried out on the basis of data and facts rather than emotions. So we will discuss the process of delimitation, how it is carried out, the contentions of both the northern states and the southern states, the international practices related to delimitation, and a few practical feasible solutions which can be adopted for delimitation. This is important in GS2 under the topic Indian Constitution, Significant Provisions and Amendments. First, let's discuss a few basics like what is a territorial constituency and what is delimitation. A territorial constituency means a defined geographical area. A geographical area which is defined and which comprises of the voters. The voters elect their representatives. Those representatives become part of a larger representative body, for example, the parliament or the state legislative assemblies. And the delimitation is the process of drawing the limits to these territorial constituencies. It is the process of defining the territorial limits for these constituencies and allocating the seats to the various states. The seats for the parliament which the states will be sending their representatives for. There are constitutional provisions for delimitation. For example, Article 81. The Article 81 clause 2 specifically provides that for each state, the number of seats which will be allocated to it, the number of MPs that the state will be sending to the Lok Sabha in proportion to their population will be the same for each state. That is, the number of seats for each state divided by the population for each state, for state 1 and state 2 should be equal. For example, if there are 10 MPs which are sent by the state of Haryana to the Lok Sabha and it has 3 crore population, and the state of Uttar Pradesh has about 24 crore population, then it should send 8 times the number of MPs which Haryana sends, that is 80 MPs. These numbers are approximate. Therefore, the number of MPs that a state will be sending to the parliament will be in proportion to its population. This does not apply to the states which are having less than 60 lakh population. That is, to ensure that the states having smaller population, they are also getting adequate representation in the parliament. Also, within the states also, the territorial constituencies are so carved out that within each territorial constituency, there is approximately the same size of population. That is, one MP within a state should be representing approximately the same number of people as another MP within that state. This is as per Article 81, subclause 2. As per Article 82, after each census, the parliament goes for the reallocation of the seats which are given to each state, the number of Lok Sabha seats, and the territorial constituencies are redrawn after each census. But post 84th Constitutional Amendment Act, it was frozen, the delimitation was frozen. That is, the number of seats which were allocated to each state, they were frozen on the basis of 1971 census. And within each state, the territorial constituencies were redrawn on the basis of 2001 census. After that, it has remained frozen until the census which is carried out after the year 2026. Then there is Article 170, which is providing similar provisions for the carving out of territorial constituencies within each state for the state legislative assembly elections. There is also Article 330, which provides that there should be certain number of seats which can be reserved for the people belonging to the scheduled caste or scheduled tribes. Now, the number of seats which can be reserved in each state proportionately should be equal. For example, the total number of SC seats in each state divided by the total number of seats in that state should be approximately equal to the SC population in that state divided by the total population in that state. This should be applied approximately in all the states. That is, the ratio between the number of scheduled caste seats or the scheduled tribe seats to the total number of seats should be approximately equal to the ratio between the scheduled caste population or scheduled tribe population in that state to the total population of that state. Similarly, Article 332 provides for the reservation for the state legislative assembly elections or the territorial constituencies within the state for the reservation of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes also. Now, what is the role of the delimitation? Why this is required? First, it ensures that there is equal representation. The value of vote of each person in that state should be the same. That one person, one vote principle should be followed. Why delimitation will be required? Suppose there is migration which happens, then delimitation process will ensure that the regions from where out migration has happened, there the number of people that they will be sending to the Lok Sabha, that will be reduced, and the region where the population has increased, there the proportionate representation should increase, the number of MPs should also increase. So the demographic shifts, they are taken care of through the delimitation exercise. Also, it ensures that there are regional as well as demographic representations. For example, the marginalized communities, they should also get the representation. For example, the reservation of certain seats for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, that is ensured through the delimitation exercise. Also, it will ensure that the population shifts are reflected. For example, there are rural to urban migrations also which are happening. If the delimitation is not conducted, then the rural people which are decreasing in number, the rural population which is decreasing, that will get overrepresented, whereas the urban population will get underrepresented if the delimitation is not carried out. Similarly, delimitation will also prevent the gerrymandering. Gerrymandering means the manipulation of the territorial constituencies for electoral gains. Also, it will ensure effective governance because the delimitation exercise takes into account various other factors also. For example, the geographical features, the population size and population density of the region. Now, how is this process carried out, the process of delimitation? First, the census is conducted. The data of the census is published. After that, the Parliament enacts a delimitation act. As per the delimitation act, a delimitation commission is formed. After every delimitation act, the first delimitation commission which was formed, it comprised of 3 members. 2 of them were coming from the judicial background and 1 was the ex officio member, that is the chief election commissioner. There were also the associate members which were included in the first delimitation commission, which were representing the states, but they did not have the voting rights. Now, what is the current scenario? The usual practice now for the establishment of delimitation commission, it comprises of the chief election commissioner and 1 judicial member, usually a retired Supreme Court judge who functions as the chairperson of the delimitation commission, and also the state election commissioners. After the delimitation commission is formed, it conducts the delimitation exercise and its order is published after the delimitation exercise is finished, and the orders of the delimitation commission are considered as final and binding. Now let's discuss the delimitation exercises conducted in India till now. The first delimitation was conducted after the Delimitation Commission Act 1952, which was enacted after the 1951 census. The first Delimitation Commission recommended that we should reserve the seats for the persons belonging to scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and also up to 2 Lok Sabha seats can be reserved for the persons belonging to the Anglo-Indian community. The second delimitation happened after 1961 census. The Delimitation Commission Act 1962 was enacted and a new Delimitation Commission was framed. It recommended that each assembly seat in a state should be within a single parliamentary seat. For example, if this is a parliamentary seat in a state, there can be several assembly seats within the parliamentary seat. The Delimitation Commission recommended that one assembly seat should be within a single parliamentary seat. It should not span across more than one parliamentary seat. And it recommended that the reservation of the seats for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes should be done in those areas where there is a high concentration. That is, the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe reserved seats should be in those areas where there is a high concentration of population of the scheduled caste or the scheduled tribes. The next delimitation happened after the 1971 census, and the Lok Sabha seats, they were also reallocated among the states. The constituencies were readjusted except the state of Jammu and Kashmir. But the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act put a freeze on the further reallocation of the seats among the states until 2001. The number of seats which were allotted to each state, the number of MPs that each state is sending to the parliament, that was frozen on the basis of 1971 census till the 2001 census. The rationale given behind it was that the states which are having lower population growth, they should not be penalized, because India was anyway going through a high population growth phase at that time. Therefore, the phase from 1971 to 2001, that is a phase of interregnum. Therefore, no delimitation commission was constituted after 1975 during this phase. Although the election commission itself was functioning as the delimitation commission, for example, for the locating of additional reserved constituencies, and therefore the seats for the each state for the sending of MPs to the Lok Sabha, they were frozen. The state assembly seats, they also remained frozen. Then the fourth delimitation commission was constituted after the 84th Constitutional Amendment Act. Through the 84th Constitutional Amendment Act, the redrawing of the constituency boundaries within each state was allowed, but the number of seats that were allotted to each state was frozen on the basis of 1971 census itself. The earlier moratorium was from 1971 to 2001. The 84th Constitutional Amendment Act extended the moratorium. The moratorium was extended until after 2026 census. The number of seats, the Lok Sabha seats allotted to each state, they were frozen till the first census after 2026. The justification given was that there is a hope that there will be uniform population growth by 2026. Although the number of Lok Sabha seats, they have been increasing ever since the first delimitation from 1952, then 1962, 72 and 2002. Now, if the delimitation is carried out on the basis of 2026 census, then the southern states are wary that they may end up losing the political representation, because they have taken the population control measures. The population control measures, for example, the total fertility rate. The total fertility rate has come down in the southern states. In Kerala, it is close to 1.8. In Tamil Nadu, it is closer to 1.7. The national average is around 2.2. In the northern states, it is way higher. For example, in Uttar Pradesh, it is about 2.7. In Bihar, it is even higher, around 3.4. Therefore, if the number of Lok Sabha seats are the same, the total number is the same, it is not increased, then the southern states may end up losing the number of seats that they are having now. For example, if the total number of Lok Sabha seats remains same, then the state of Kerala may end up losing 6 seats in Lok Sabha, and the state of Tamil Nadu may end up losing 9 seats in the Lok Sabha, because the population growth rates in the southern states now has been way lower after the 1971 census as compared to the northern states. As we can observe, the change in the average population size per constituency In the southern states, for example, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, it is closer to 200% only, less than 200%. Whereas the change in the average population size per constituency in the northern states, for example, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, it is closer to 300%. Therefore, the delimitation, if it is carried out only on the basis of population as the criteria, then the total number of seats which will be allocated proportionately to the southern states will come down as compared to the total number of seats in proportion to the northern states. There is the economic dimension also. For example, the contribution to GDP for the southern states is comparatively higher in comparison to their population. For example, the state of Tamil Nadu, the Tamil Nadu population as a percentage of India's population is just about 6.5%, whereas its contribution to India's GDP is close to 8.4%. Therefore, the contribution to GDP is higher as a percentage as compared to the percentage population. They have concerns related to funding and tax devolution also. For example, the 15th Finance Commission, it utilized the 2011 census as the criteria rather than the 1971 census for making its recommendations. Therefore, the funds which were to be devolved to the southern states, they were lesser. Similarly, they argue for equitable representation rather than equal representation, as otherwise it may lead to regional tensions, cooperative federalism, etc. Also, there are other concerns related to delimitation. For example, the delimitation in India is mostly population centric. We do not take into account the other factors. For example, geographical features, the contribution to GDP, the economic output, etc., which can also be considered for the delimitation exercise. And there is a lack of public participation as well. The public consultation is negligible in the delimitation exercise. Additionally, the reserved constituencies, the manner in which they are reserved, that does not reflect properly the distribution of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe populations in that state. Now let's also have a look at the perspective of the northern states as well. They claim that they have the constitutional right to the proportional representation. The constitutional mandate under Articles 81 and 82 has to be fulfilled. For example, currently the one MP of Tamil Nadu represents the 18 lakh people, whereas one MP in Uttar Pradesh, one constituency is comprising of 25 lakh people. The number of people that each MP should represent should be approximately equal throughout India. And they argue that since they have a larger population, therefore they have larger developmental needs, infrastructure needs, etc., which can be fulfilled through larger political representation. And there are economic indicators also. For example, the per capita income. The per capita income in Bihar is closer to 30,000 only, whereas in Kerala the per capita income is almost 5 times closer to 1.5 lakh, the per capita income in Kerala. And they also argue that the 84th Constitutional Amendment Act, that was a temporary measure. The freezing of the seats, the freezing of reallocation of the seats among the states based upon the 1971 census, that was a temporary measure. Such temporary measures cannot be used to overcome the constitutional mandate prescribed through Article 81 and 82. Plus, obviously, they will end up gaining more seats if the delimitation is carried out on the basis of census 2026, as Uttar Pradesh may end up gaining about 17 seats and Bihar may also end up gaining 11 seats in the Lok Sabha if the delimitation is carried out on the basis of the next census. Now let's have a look at the practices related to delimitation adopted in the other countries. In USA, there is a decennial census. A census is conducted every 10 years, and based on that, the boundaries of the territorial constituencies of the congressional districts, that is redrawn. They adopt the Huntington Hill method, that is also known as the method of the equal proportions. In this method, all the states are guaranteed at least one seat. All the 50 states, there are 50 states in USA, each state gets one seat first. After that, the remaining seats, they are divided using the method of equal proportions, giving one seat at a time to the state having the highest average district population. In UK, there are independent boundary commissions which are set up. The boundary commissions consider not only population as the criteria, but also give weightage to the geography, the geographical features, the interests of the local community, and the public consultations are also done by the boundary commissions. In South Africa, there is independent electoral commission which is set up, and it takes into account both inclusivity as well as proportionality. The model of inclusivity which is adopted in South Africa, it is suitable for India also, because both the countries have diversity in their populations. In European Union, there is digressive proportionality model. This model is the midway approach between the two approaches. One approach is each state sending a fixed number of representatives. The other approach is each state sending the number of representatives proportional to its population. The digressive proportionality model is a midway approach between the two. For example, in Germany, minimum 3 seats are allocated to each province irrespective of its population, and there are a limit of the maximum number of seats also, maximum 6 seats irrespective of the population in that province. So this is digressive proportionality model. Now, what can be the potential solutions that we can recommend, the feasible solutions which can be explored? One, we can put in place alternative formulas also for seat allocation. We can explore a hybrid system. For example, 50% of the seats on the basis of population as the criteria, and 50% of the seats on the basis of other criteria. For example, geographical area of that constituency or the state. For example, the economic contribution or the developmental indicators of that state. Similarly, the population coefficient models can also be explored. For example, the rewarding of the state if it achieves success in the national goals of achieving demographic goals. And we can even explore the digressive proportionality model also. Or even a two-chamber system can be explored within the Lok Sabha. That is, one chamber having the representation on the basis of population and another chamber having the representation, maybe an equal representation for the states. And the economic federalism measures can also be explored. For example, giving special development packages or weighted resource allocation among the states. So what is the way forward that we can recommend? One, we can recommend the establishment of a constitutional review commission with a focus upon delimitation, focus upon the redrawing of territorial constituency boundaries. We can also explore the phased delimitation, the delimitation spread over 3 election cycles, for example, or the establishment of a federal representation index, an index with parameters like the population density, population size, geographical area, literacy rate, healthcare, development indicators, etc. And we can also go for a periodic reassessment of the representation formulas themselves. For example, encoding it within the constitution that there will be a 15-year review of the representation formulas itself. Or exploring the technological solutions, giving the citizens digital participation platforms, that the citizens can participate digitally in the national policy making. It can serve as an alternative, as rather a complementary measure to the conventional representative nature of the elections in the democracy. And going for a charter of federal fairness, putting in place a charter along with a framework for dispute resolution with the consent of the states, that the disputes related to the representativeness, federal representation or the delimitation can be resolved through it. Now, there is a mains practice question also. Delimitation is essential for ensuring fair political representation, but it also poses significant challenges in a diverse democracy like India. Examine the constitutional provisions related to delimitation in India and discuss the challenges in its implementation. Please try to write it. The next article is related to the drug quality and the issue of spurious drugs in India. As the death of at least 10 children in the states of Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan has been linked to the adulteration of diethylene glycol in a cough syrup. So we will discuss the classification of drugs as the poor quality drugs in India, the issues in the pharma sector in India, and a few suggestions in this regard. This is important in GS3 under the topic Science and Technology, Developments and Applications, and the Effects in Everyday Life. First, let's have a look at the classification of drugs as poor quality drugs as per the Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940. As per the Act, a drug can be classified as a drug not of standard quality. A drug is classified as a drug of not of standard quality if it does not meet the quality guidelines or it does not meet the specifications defined under the Act. The drug can also be classified as spurious if it is imported under another drug's name, or it is an imitation of another drug, or it is a substitute of another drug, or it has been manufactured by a fictitious manufacturer or a non-existing manufacturer, that is whose source cannot be traced. Or a drug can also be labeled as misbranded drug if it has been colored or coated or otherwise changed to conceal the damage that it may cause, or to change its therapeutic value. The branding in terms of therapeutic value is false, that the label of the drug is false, and there are misleading claims that they are claiming more therapeutic value of the drug than what is the reality. A drug can also be classified as adulterated drug under the Drugs and Cosmetic Act 1940 if it is having filthy substances, putrid or decomposed substances, or it has been prepared, manufactured and stored in insanitary conditions, or it is also having any poisonous or deleterious substance that is dangerous, or it has been adulterated with or mixed with any substance to reduce its quality or strength, etc. Now let's also have a look at the status of pharma industry. Why is it so important for us? India is the third largest in the world in terms of pharma production by volume. In terms of pharma production by value, India is the 14th largest in the world, and 50% of the global vaccines are manufactured in India. 20% of the global generic medicines demand is met by India, and the pharmacy industry is contributing more than 1.7% to India's GDP, and it is about $50 billion industry. But there are certain issues in the pharma sector, particularly related to the drug quality, for example, the spurious drugs. In India, the spurious drugs penalty is poor. For example, the 54th Parliamentary Standing Committee, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Chemicals and Fertilizers, had observed that the conviction rate for the spurious drugs is low in India. We need to set up either special courts, plus we need to also increase the number of samples that we are collecting for testing of the spurious drugs, and it has happened earlier also. For example, the adulteration with the same material, diethylene glycol in cough syrup, led to the death of more than 80 children in Gambia. That was also manufactured in India. Plus, there is no law to recall the bad drugs in India, unlike in USA, where is the law to recall the bad drugs, the drugs of inferior quality. And the prevalence of fixed dose combination drugs has been increasing because it is convenient, it is economic also, it is cheaper to manufacture. The fixed dose combination drugs are those drugs which are having more than one active pharmaceutical ingredients. It is convenient for the doctor also, as the instructions are very few for their adherence. But if it causes an adverse reaction, it is difficult to find out which active pharmaceutical ingredient caused that adverse drug reaction. Plus, the therapeutic value, the efficacy, the determination of efficacy of a particular ingredient is difficult there. Also, there are financial challenges also. The financial disbursement which is done to the state level agencies for the drug safety as well as the drug quality control, that is poor. And the e-pharmacies, they also compete with the brick and mortar pharmacies, but there are very few rules that they comply with. For example, the e-pharmacies like Tata 1mg, PharmEasy, etc. And we are still dependent upon import for the active pharmaceutical ingredients. We need to go for more domestic production of the active pharmaceutical ingredients for improving the drug quality. And the overuse of the drugs has also led to antimicrobial resistance. The bacteria for which the drug was supposed to treat, that bacteria has developed resistance against that drug itself. And the prevalence of generic medicines, the quality control there becomes even difficult because the good manufacturing practices, the GMP and the quality check, the regulation becomes costly. So what are the suggestions that we can give for improving the drug quality and the pharma sector in general also? One, for the spurious drugs, we can follow the recommendations of the 54th Parliamentary Standing Committee on Chemicals and Fertilizers, as it has recommended that we can set up special courts, plus we can also go for more number of samples collection for the testing of the drugs. The Malshekar Committee on the Drug Regulation recommended that we can set up a national drug authority. The regulation mechanism should be proper, and we should put in place a law to recall the bad drugs. As per the Kokate Committee, the usage of fixed dose combination drugs is irrational. Therefore, it had recommended the phasing out of the fixed dose combination drugs. We can promote the domestic API manufacturing, for example, through the PLI scheme, production linked incentive scheme, or maybe the bulk drug parks for the manufacturing of APIs domestically. The regulatory and quality compliance should also be improved, as well as the regulation of e-pharmacies can also be improved. Additionally, let's have a look at the role of the Central Drug Standard Control Organization in this regard. The Central Drug Standard Control Organization is headed by the Drug Controller General of India, and it functions under the Ministry of Health. It performs its functions under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act 1940. What does it do? It approves the new drugs and clinical trials. It provides for import registration and licensing. It even approves the licenses for blood banks, vaccines, new medical devices, etc. It can propose amendments to the Drugs and Cosmetics Act, and it frames the rules under the Drugs and Cosmetics Act. It can even ban the drugs and cosmetics which are not adhering to the quality guidelines or the specifications under the Act. It can grant test licenses, it can provide for NOCs, no objection certificates, for the export of drugs, and provide assistance in the testing of new drugs. It can also provide the oversight and market surveillance as well in this regard. Additionally, there is a mains practice question. Substandard and counterfeit drugs poses a serious threat to public health. Discuss the major issues affecting drug quality in India. Give suggestions to address these challenges. Please try to write it. The next article is related to farm fires, especially in the state of Punjab. This is important in GS3 under the topic environment. Before coming to the article, let's discuss a few basics first. The farm fires are usually caused by stubble burning. Stubble burning is the burning of the stubble, the crop residue which is left after the harvesting of the crop. As per a study of IIT Kanpur in 2015, about 17 to 26% of PM pollution in Delhi is due to biomass burning in the winters. The PM pollution, that is particulate matter pollution, 17 to 26% is coming due to the stubble burning, biomass burning in the winters. As per the SAFER data, about 40% contribution to air pollution at its peak level is coming from the biomass burning, the crop residue burning. And it is exacerbated because of the temperature inversion. The temperature inversion happens in Delhi because of the continental climate, clear skies and winter nights, which traps the air pollution such as smoke plus fog near the ground. Now, what are the reasons behind crop residue burning, stubble burning? Because it facilitates the seed bed preparation, it facilitates the seeding of the new crop, and it is a quick and cheap method for getting rid of the crop residue. Also, the other method, for example happy seeder, it is expensive. Happy seeder is agriculture machinery which helps in the seeding without the removal of the crop residue. It cuts and pushes the crop residue aside, then it plants the seeds and then drops the crop residue back, the stubble back, which also functions as protective mulch as well. So this is a zero till method, no till method for the planting of the seeds, but it is expensive and the input costs in agriculture are already high. So what the impact of the crop residue burning, stubble burning? One, there is environmental pollution due to it, the increase in the PM10 and PM2.5 levels, and during the November month in the northern Indian region, the pollution becomes even higher. It causes a blanket of smog. For example, in Delhi, the methane emission as well as the carbon monoxide emission. Also, it adversely impacts the soil health also. For example, the nutrients which are there in the crop residue, the stubble, they are burnt and the organic carbon content is also lost. Simultaneously, in the fires, the microbes also die and it lowers the nitrogen and the carbon content as well. It has an adverse impact on the human beings also. For example, it causes skin irritation, it can cause neurological disorders as well as respiratory diseases and lower the life expectancy in the long run. And in terms of fertilizer and electricity subsidies also, it causes a burden on the state exchequer because more fertilizers will be required, more electricity will be required, as we want the same yield and we want more productivity of the same crops. So what are the steps taken to prevent the stubble burning till now? One, there is the scheme of promotion of agricultural mechanization for in situ management of crop residue. Through this, 50% of the financial assistance is provided by the government for the agricultural mechanization to prevent the crop residue burning, and 80% assistance is also provided for the farmer producer organization cooperative societies to procure the agricultural machinery, for example happy seeders or combine harvesters or rotavators, etc. And the funds release also happens about 3000 crores in 5 years to the NCR states to prevent stubble burning. There is the development of Pusa decomposer by the Indian Agriculture Research Institute. The Pusa decomposer is a fungi based liquid solution through which the hard crop residue is softened, and in about 20 days it is turned into manure that helps us in the organic compost formation also and preventing the stubble burning as well. The Punjab government in the past proposed that we can give 2.5 thousand cash incentive per acre to the farmers for not going for stubble burning. Awareness camps can be organized. Also, the deputy commissioners meeting the farm union leaders, also ex situ management as well. For example, engaging the biomass handling units or the Bilkins mandating to use the stubble as fuel for them so that the stubble can be sold to the brick kilns. Now, what is the way forward that we can recommend for preventing stubble burning? One, we can adopt alternative farming practices, for example zero tillage, crop diversification, direct seeding for example through happy seeder. We can employ harvesting machinery, for example combine harvesters. They cut at a lower height, therefore lesser stubble is left behind. We can conduct awareness campaigns not to burn stubble. It can be utilized as animal feed. It can be recycled and utilized as manure also. It can be used in power generation as well as a raw material for bioethanol production. As India anyway needs more energy, we import crude oil as well as natural gas. We can go for pelletization, convert the crop residue, the stubble into pellets, mix it with coal and then go for power generation through it. The Chhattisgarh Gauthans is a good initiative in this regard. As they mix the stubble with cow dung, it is converted into organic manure. The seed varieties can also be improved, for example exploring Pusa Basmati rice. Now coming to the article, there is a paradox which is observed in Punjab. In 2024, the farm fires which was recorded in Punjab, the number of farm fires have come down, but the total burnt area in Punjab has risen slightly. So it has raised the doubts over the accuracy of the fire incident data. There are claims that to avoid the detection, the farmers may have been burning the stubble after the satellites have passed over the region. While the farm fires are recorded daily, but the burnt area is measured by the satellites on a weekly basis. Therefore, this menace needs to be curbed. The next article is related to Cyclone Shakti. This is important in GS1 under the topic Important Geophysical Phenomena such as Cyclones. First, let's discuss the formation of cyclones, how they are formed. The cyclones formation requires usually warm sea surface temperatures. When there is warm sea surface temperature, there is availability of warm and moist air. This warm and moist air starts rising. When it rises from the sea surface, then there is a creation of low pressure area near the sea surface. In this low pressure area, the air from the surrounding region comes in, and there is the cloud formation also because of the presence of moisture, presence of water in the moist air which is rising. The cloud is formed, and this complete system of clouds and wind, it starts spinning and growing. As the speed of spinning increases, there is a formation of the eye in the center. The center remains calm and this remains an area of low pressure, and this is how the cyclone looks like, the cyclone Shakti also. Now let's have a look at the changing trends in the cyclone formation and the regional patterns which have shifted. For example, in the Arabian Sea, the frequency of the cyclones has increased because of the availability of warmer sea surface temperatures. Similarly, a study of 2021, a climate dynamic study, pointed out that the positive correlation is there between warmer sea surface temperature and the longer lasting cyclones. That is due to the availability of warmer sea surface temperatures, the more number of cyclones are formed and longer lasting cyclones are formed. When we compare it with Bay of Bengal, historically the number of cyclones which were there in the Bay of Bengal were more, but now the frequency in the Arabian Sea has been increasing because of warmer sea surface temperatures. The IMD, Indian Meteorological Department, has observed that the lower wind shear, lower vertical wind shear also helps in the cyclone formation. Plus there is a seasonal context also. For example, from the months of October to December, these are the months when more number of cyclones are formed. Now the cyclone Shakti will create certain challenges for us. For example, it is an indicator that the climate change is intensifying. For example, the rising sea surface temperatures, and it will cause coastal erosion and landform damage also because of the strong winds and storm surges. It will damage the beaches, mangroves, etc. It will cause losses to agriculture, for example, through salinity intrusion, flooding damage, which will impact the agriculture as well as aquaculture, and it is also rendering the infrastructure vulnerable, for example the roads, power lines, etc., especially in the far-flung areas. And it will cause adverse socio-economic impact as well, for example the displacement and the loss of income for the people living in those regions. Let's also have a look at how the IMD classifies the cyclones in India. A cyclonic storm is classified as a cyclonic storm if the wind speed is from 62 to 88 km per hour. For example, cyclone Neelam in 2012. A cyclonic storm is classified as severe if the wind speed increases from 89 to 117 km per hour. For example, cyclone Okhi in 2017. And very severe cyclonic storm if the wind speed is between 118 to 165 km per hour, for example cyclone Hudhud in 2014, and extremely severe cyclonic storm if the wind speed is between 166 to 220 km per hour, for example cyclone Tokte in 2021, and a super cyclone if the wind speed is more than 221 km per hour, for example the Odisha super cyclone in 1999. The next article is related to Gaza peace plan. This is important in GS2 under the topic effect of politics and policies of developed and developing countries on India's interests. The Gaza peace plan is a 20-point plan proposed by President Trump. It proposes that the Hamas will be disarmed. They will be surrendering, they will be disarmed, and the members of Hamas who will be committing to peaceful coexistence, they will be granted amnesty. But the people who will not be willing, the unwilling, can leave Gaza. They will be allowed to leave Gaza. There will be the establishment of an international stabilization force. It will be a temporary force. It will be backed by the USA as well as the Arab partners. What will it do? It will train the vetted Palestinian police. It will stop the arms inflow. It will also facilitate the aid inflow into Gaza. And Israel has in return pledged not to annex Gaza. And meanwhile, the ISF will take control over the region. Regarding the governance, there will be the setting up of a technocratic, apolitical Palestinian committee, which will have an oversight from an international board of peace. This international board of peace will be led by Trump and other leaders, for example, even the former Prime Minister of UK, Tony Blair. This will ensure neutral governance and it will oversee the reconstruction as well as the aid measures. The peace plan also observes that the humanitarian aid will be restarted. There will be the large-scale humanitarian aid including the rehabilitation of water, electricity and healthcare systems. The reconstruction and aid will be overseen by the United Nations, Red Crescent and other international agencies. There will be a hostage prisoner exchange between Israel and Hamas. Within 72 hours of the acceptance of the peace plan by Israel, all the hostages by the Hamas must be returned. In return, Israel will release 250 prisoners that it has who are serving life terms. It will also release 1700 Gazans that it has detained ever since October 7, 2023. Also, there are regional and global guarantees which may help the peace plan in coming to fruition. For example, compliance can be ensured through guarantees from regional partners. Even China and Russia have also expressed support for the peace plan. What is India's stand on the peace plan of Trump? One, we see it as a viable pathway to long-term peace in the region. It will ensure peace, security and development for Palestinians, Israelis and also the wider Middle East region, the West Asian region in general. We see West Asia as a part of our extended neighborhood because we have deep ties with Israel also, Iran also, Saudi Arabia also, and therefore Prime Minister Modi has endorsed the Gaza peace plan of Trump despite our ongoing frictions with USA. Now, what does the Gaza peace plan mean for India? One, it will help us in safeguarding our diaspora. 90 lakh Indians are there in the Middle East, 18,000 are there in Israel itself. Also, we have energy ties with the region. We need energy security and trade ties. 80% of our crude oil is imported from the Middle East. It will help us in stabilizing the energy prices as well. And the greater Arab investment will be flowing into India if there is stability in the Middle East. Also, it will help us in completing the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, which is a strategically significant corridor for us, the connectivity project. But there are strategic concerns also. For example, Pakistan's role in the peace plan. There is a visible involvement of Pakistan in the peace process. Trump has thanked them publicly also. Therefore, this revived USA-Pakistan engagement may affect our strategic calculations. The next article is related to the response to the crowding disasters in India. This is important in GS3 under the topic disaster and disaster management. So first let's have a look at what happened in the Karur stampede. There was a political rally which was scheduled for an actor Vijay's TVK party. The crowd had assembled hours early, but the actor got late in reaching the rally and the actor's convoy also got stuck, worsening the traffic congestion, and that was also the time at which the evening wage disbursals was happening for the local workers, and at that time the people began fainting due to the huge rush as thousands of people had gathered at the venue. Now, what are the steps taken by India to manage the crowds? One, the Bureau of Police Research and Development has published the comprehensive crowd control guidelines in 2025. The National Disaster Management Authority also published a guide for managing the mass gatherings. These guidelines provide for the measures to ensure risk assessment, site planning, ingress and egress routes as well as real-time monitoring. The National Institute of Disaster Management also runs capacity building training programs for the crowd management. The Indian Railways also updated the manuals for the high footfall stations after a recent incident, providing for the management of holding areas, better dispersal zones as well as crowd monitoring. There are steps taken by various states also in this regard. For example, Karnataka came up with a crowd control bill in 2025, fixing the responsibility on the organizers. In Karnataka, the local police also became active. For example, the circulation of the SOPs, standard operating procedures for crowd management, requiring the crowd management plans as well as route diversions. In Uttar Pradesh, the government formed the formal guidelines for managing crowd at events in 2023. In Gujarat, the Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management gave training materials on site capacity, exits and safety. In Uttarakhand, there are safety updates at major temples after a stampede which happened there. In Maharashtra, also there was a bill which was introduced to empower the authorities for large gatherings like the Kumbh Mela. So we can go for the scientific crowd control also to ensure that the stampede like disasters do not happen. Now, what is scientific crowd control? It focuses on controlling the crowd density and avoiding the hazardous flow patterns. We can utilize technology for that, for example, drone cameras for real-time density monitoring. We can avoid channeling the crowds into bottlenecks, slopes or counterflows. The main cause of death during such disasters is not trampling, rather it is compressive asphyxia, that is lack of oxygen availability. So what are the safety tips that the individual can follow? For example, the forearms can be placed across the chest to protect the breathing space, and there can be staggered footing for balance so that the person does not fall, and the movement can be diagonally towards the less dense edges, and if a person falls, then it's better to roll to the side while protecting the head and neck rather than trying to rise. The rigid barriers should be avoided and stopping should be avoided, as well as if an item is dropped then retrieving it should be avoided. The organizers can also follow certain guidelines. For example, real-time monitoring should be done by trained managers. There should be one directional traffic flow rather than chaos. And there should be multiple exits and unambiguous signage also to help people in decoding where they should move. The public address messaging should be there, as well as the on-site medical facilities to minimize the damage. The next article is related to a probable specter of empty classrooms. This is important in GS2 under the topic education. The context behind it is that the state of Tamil Nadu has sought a review of a Supreme Court judgment on the teachers' eligibility test. The Supreme Court judgment had observed that the teachers who have not qualified the teachers' eligibility test, they should be compulsorily retired. In Tamil Nadu, there are about 4.5 lakh teachers total in the government schools plus the aided schools, and 3.9 lakh out of them are not teachers' eligibility test qualified. Now, if all of them are compulsorily retired, this may lead to a mass disqualification, and it may lead to a collapse of the entire school system itself, and it denies the classroom instruction to the millions of children studying in the government schools in Tamil Nadu, and it also conflicts with the right to education, that is Article 21A. Therefore, a balance should be maintained between the education quality and the requirements under the right to education. So, what has the Supreme Court observed in the judgment? The mandate of the Supreme Court judgment provides that the in-service teachers from classes 1 to 8 in the non-minority schools, they should clear the teachers' eligibility test. It must be cleared within 2 years from the date of this judgment. A 2-year deadline has been placed, and the teachers failing the teachers' eligibility test must be compulsorily retired. Exemptions have been provided for the teachers who are having less than 5 years of service until retirement, but if they want to get promotion, then they must also clear the teachers eligibility test as per the judgment. Also, the future appointments and promotions will be contingent upon the person clearing the teachers eligibility test. Regarding the minority institutions, whether the same criteria should be imposed, the question has been referred by the Supreme Court to a larger bench. It also criticized the 2014 judgment that had exempted the minority institutions from the right to education, and it was observed by the court that it may jeopardize the universal elementary education if they are exempted from Right to Education Act. Now, what are the arguments of the Tamil Nadu government seeking its review? It observes that the penalty is manifestly disproportionate for the teachers who have been appointed before the enactment of the Right to Education Act, and we can use the less intrusive alternatives, for example giving them in-service training and giving them refresher courses. Also, the section 23 clause 1 of the RT Act applies only to future teacher recruitment. It should not be applied retrospectively. The retrospective disqualification of validly appointed teachers should not happen, and it may lead to a specter of empty classrooms if all of them are disqualified like this, and the teachers will also be distracted from their core function, that of teaching. And the proviso to section 23 of the RT Act gave a 5-year period for the existing teachers to acquire the qualifications. This 5-year period has already passed. Therefore, the government of Tamil Nadu is seeking a review of the Supreme Court judgment. Thank you.